Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Jim Holmes, and I'll be getting started in just a moment. I see that a lot of people are still filtering in, so I'm going to give it just another 15 or 30 seconds for folks to filter in, and then we'll get started. A couple housekeeping things. This webinar is going to run about an hour. We will indeed have some question and answer time at the end. So if you'd like, if you come up with a question or an idea during the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A panel in the GoToWebinar toolkit over there, and you can queue up if you've got some questions, and I'll work through them at the end. Okay, well, I will go ahead and get started now. So welcome to this webinar put on by Progress. This is quality the bottleneck? And what we're going to do is talk a bit about um, role of testing. We're going to talk about some kind of business considerations. We'll get into a little bit of test automation fundamentals. This is not a technical webinar. So we'll probably have some follow-on webinars before too long that are very technical. This is going to focus more on kind of strategy and domain level things. So I hope you find this interesting. So let me kind of rearrange my screen a little bit here. All right, so I am Jim. I'm Jim Holmes. I work for Centric Consulting, and I'm a modernization strategist. And that just means that I've been around the block a few times and I've learned a lot of things about delivering software. Uh, I'm primarily a tester, but I've had a lot of roles in my career. I've been a software developer, been a business analyst, done program management stuff. I've been a customer service hotline person. I also raised tomatoes and worked in a wine shop, but that doesn't really matter. So I have a long association with Progress, specifically Telerik and Test Studio. Many years ago, I used to be the director of engineering and lead evangelist for Test Studio. I love that as a tool, and as part of that, had spent quite a bit of time in Sofia working with the Bulgarian team on Test Studio. Now, really, it's a great bunch of people. They really care about getting things done right. This was from an outing that we had back, I think it was 2013 or 2014. And I want to point out something very important. If you have the opportunity to travel to foreign lands and work with people, getting good communication in place is really, really critical. The key thing here was that during this day-long hike, I found out that I and my colleagues had a very large misunderstanding about what easy hikes really meant. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to go ahead and shut off my camera here so the screen's a little fuller. So through this hour, I've got a lot of content, a lot of points, and I never find that everybody picks up everything, and that's really not the point. Hopefully, at the end of the day, what you're going to find are one or two kind of key points that might help you look at things differently with how your organization, you, your team, your company ship software, and how you involve quality in that, and particularly how you might address if quality is viewed as a bottleneck. And we'll talk more about that. But first off, we've got a survey that I'd like folks to have a look at. So there's an open poll here, and you should be able to see that on your screen. And I'd appreciate if you could have a little bit of response there. And let me know some of the things that you are seeing as challenges to quality in your organization. And you can just click buttons there and answer those questions. Okay, so this is really helpful. We're collecting responses, we're getting some answers here, and okay, the poll's closed. So apologies, I don't know if you're seeing the poll results up on your screen, but it was pretty clear that a lot of folks are feeling challenges around people being stretched thin. And that's pretty interesting because that's good alignment with quality being a bottleneck. Testing, there's only so many testers, people filling that role or that activity. Um, and so the second most answered response, getting testing early in the cycle. That happens to be something I'm very passionate about. So thanks for taking that little poll. We'll have two more as we continue on. So let's talk for a moment about what's changing in quality, um, really kind of focusing on the current environment. So I'm finding, and with a lot of people that I talk to, there's a lot of economic pressure. Digital experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get to it, is bringing some very interesting dynamics to how we approach building, testing, and releasing good software. And then also, I think that individual value that we can bring to an organization as testers or developers or delivery team members is undergoing some change. And I find this fascinating. So, economics, you know, we're in crazy times at the moment with COVID, and a lot of organizations are really struggling with budget, with finances. So, as software delivery team members who are concerned about making sure we get good value, we've got to be understanding of some of the economic pressures and understand how we might be able to help that. So if we're thinking of bottlenecks and we're thinking of impacts on the value that we're delivering, we see a lot of times things around high amounts of rework. So we've missed requirements, or we got requirements wrong, or we just had a lot of defects. We had quality issues. Um, a lot of times also this can manifest with high support costs. So if you're releasing software that's struggling in quality and that goes out to the users and the users are having problems with it, then you end up with a lot of support effort. Now, this is regardless whether you're a company that offers service to the public or end users, or a team that's delivering value internally to your organization. If you've got buggy software, if you've got software that's hard to use, you get a lot of users that are calling into the support line or filing email tickets or whatever. Point being, quality can really have a significant impact on that aspect. And that can unfortunately lead to significant loss of sales and reputation. But if we think about some ways to try to address or mitigate that or lessen that impact and remove some of the bottleneck, remove some of those impacts, we'll talk more about this as we go on, but more collaboration. The notion that there should be a separate test team rather than having testers embedded on a program, on a project. Um, that separate test team is a very traditional minded view. And I don't mean that dismissively, but rather, as we've learned more, the best successes are coming through that whole team approach. And that means having developers and testers and BAs working together. It means getting testing done earlier. It means having collaboration around what quality should look like and how we're building the software. And all of that should be as early as possible. And I'm very interested that roughly 30% of you who responded to that survey mentioned getting testing earlier. I think also something that we've learned a lot more about is having a clearer understanding of risk and value, and not just at the technical level, regardless whether you're a developer or a tester or a BA or whomever, but at the business value level. So understanding what's keeping the stakeholders awake at night, why they're trying to release software to fill particular needs. So another thing that I think is very pertinent, that's really taking a significant change in how we look at building software, is digital experience, or DX. And in a previous job, I was really fortunate to work with a team of really expert level digital experience folks. And initially, I thought DX was kind of bogus. I thought it was yet another bad marketing blurb term that really didn't mean anything. And boy, I was wrong. What I found fascinating and really useful and educational to me as someone involved in quality was how good DX people have a complete different focus on how to empower or enable users to do better work. So as I was on a couple projects with these people, I found it fascinating because I've talked a lot about really engaging users, but watching DX people work hard and closely early on in the cycle with users, doing things like journey mapping, really in-depth interviews where they're listening to what users are trying to do, and running workshops around this. And as someone involved in quality, it helped me understand how to be a better user proxy. You know, if you're a tester by trade, oftentimes you'll hear the kind of the card thrown out, oh, QA or testers are the user proxy. Well, it's easy to say that, but if you're looking at trying to better serve the product or the service that you're delivering, as a developer, as a tester, if you've got a really deep understanding of what the users are trying to do, what problems they're trying to solve, and how you're going to do that, it leads to so much better value, and it really does help speed up that whole notion of shipping better quality faster. And the last point there, less confusion late in the cycle. You're asking fewer why questions. Why would the user do this? Why is the user trying to accomplish these sets of tasks? DX is not just a fluffy marketing bogus term. I think good DX, good digital experience teams are fascinating, and it really gives us the opportunity to, again, kind of help remove quality as a bottleneck, because there's so much better focus on what we're trying to do. So the final point I want to talk about, kind of to me, that's changed quite a bit in the recent time frame, is that of individual value. What you as an individual team member can contribute back to the team and the organization. And it's been really interesting in the last several years, the different really fascinating domains that I've been involved in. I've been involved in some fascinating work in the finance and insurance domain. I've been involved with a really interesting sensor project where we had a small little robot, or not robot, but it was a little remote control car with sensors on it. And we were trying to help an auto manufacturer build predictive algorithms that used the sensors to avoid crashes. So the cool thing was we were working with some really fascinating technology, and our goal for this project was literally to drive this Lego RC car as fast as it would go at a wall and not have it break. Something else fascinating in the area is the emphasis on big data. And yes, we've had data and analytics for a long time, but what I find interesting is the overlap with my first point there about bias. And when I'm speaking about bias here, think of financial models and even insurance models or healthcare that focus on things like race or gender. But there's even far more around sort of looking at these algorithms when you start to consider bias about regions and socioeconomic status. Because if you're thinking finances, for example, loans or credit, or you're thinking healthcare, there's a huge amount of complexity there that if I, as an individual, am starting to better understand what modeling is, algorithmic modeling, scientific, mathematical. And by the way, I had to do 5th grade twice. I'm not great at math, but that doesn't mean that I can't take a great interest in helping organizations better create, understand, and validate some of these complex models. It also opens up really interesting things if you look at, for example, in the automotive domain or the engineering domain. I'm talking like physical device engineering. They use approaches called model-based design. And in a way, it's very similar to test-driven development, but using very different tools and approaches. So if you're looking to improve your value, there's great opportunities to dive into things like modeling or bias in particular domains and industries. So before we move on to the next section, we're going to jump into another survey here. And this is really around failures that you are currently seeing in the areas that you're working in. So that poll should be popping up on your screen again, and if you take a few moments to respond to that, that would be really wonderful. And by the way, as everyone's wrapping this up, there'll be some follow-up materials and communications that come out after this webinar. You'll get a follow-up email with a link to a recording of this webinar. And we'll also be posting up a blog post on Progress's infrastructure somewhere with kind of some summary and highlights. And we'll be working on, we'll respond and wrap up any questions that are answered there as well. Okay, so bugs getting into production is number one, closely followed. Oh, no, actually, prioritizing time over quality, closely followed by bugs in production, lack of appropriate tooling, maintaining tests. So I'm not surprised at the responses here. This seems very similar to my own experience and what I'm seeing in the field right now. So thanks for responding to that. So talked about what's changing in software, which I find very interesting, but the thing is that there's plenty that's still the same, that if we're looking at quality, of trying to address that perception of quality or testing as a bottleneck, here's some things that have been long running that are still valuable to have a good look at. So setting expectations, both us communicating expectations outward as well as understanding expectations of us, stakeholder engagement, and building skills and roles. So setting expectations, that's hard. We humans are difficult people, and not even intentionally so. It's just communication is hard, particularly when we start to get pressure about releasing, pressure about dates, pressure about budget. And so long-running impacts that are continual expectation management chores that I have to deal with. Um, the notion that somehow we can test everything, um, the drive that we have to automate 100% of all of our testing. And then the always hard question, how long do you need to test? So some of the ways that I find help manage that communication, help manage those expectations. If we as testers, if we as the delivery team don't understand what's important, how do we know what to focus on? So working with stakeholders, and I've got a whole nother slide to talk to on that, but working with stakeholders, working with the business to understand what's most important. If you're not familiar with lean software principles, I'd encourage you to do some reading and get really familiar with that. There's a lot of great books on it. Tom and Mary Poppendike have a series of books on lean software. And I read them years ago when they came out, and it really bent my noodle. It really changed how I viewed my role as a software professional, as somebody who cares about quality, and as a tester. By focusing on the things that are most important and really only building that first, we avoid waste. We're avoiding spending time on things that aren't high value. By understanding what's most important, it also helps us get really good clarity around risk and value, because everybody who's been a tester or everybody who's worked with a tester knows that too often testers will focus on minutia. Well, I clicked this one thing 387 times and pasted in 12 gigs of data into the text field, and I couldn't upload 397 files into this single file dialog. None of those are invalid, but are they really the most valuable and best use of our time as a delivery team to focus on? By understanding the expectations around what are the most important tasks, if we focus our time on that, then we're helping ensure that we're not contributing to that bottleneck by spending a lot of time on those low value things. And it's not that the low value things should be ignored, but we only have so many hours in a week to work. And hopefully that is 40 or fewer hours per week. Sustainable pace is one of the fundamental tenets of extreme programming. And if you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to read up on it. Overworked, overstressed teams don't deliver good value. But if we can focus in on the high value things, the things that are really important, then again, that helps us reduce bottlenecks. Gojko Adjic has a great series of books called 50 Great Ideas. One of those books is 50 Great Ideas for Improving Your Tests. And he talks through a number of different small stories or small ideas on helping focus around this low value, high value things. Simply asking questions of like always, never. For example, the system must always do X, Y, and Z. The system must never do orange, red, and blue. And if you've got good expectations around what the users need and what the stakeholders expect, it helps you focus in on those. And it helps you maintain that good flow of work through your pipeline, through your system, whatever you want to call it. So now let's talk about engaging stakeholders. And I find that too often teams don't have good relationships with stakeholders. And I don't mean like they have bad relationships. They don't have a relationship with a stakeholder. And I find this is often the case with testers who don't have any kind of communication with the stakeholder. And I think that's a shame, because one of the most important things that I think we're finally starting to change in the delivery arena is that testers do not assure quality. I'd love to just get rid of the title of quality assurance. Me as a tester, I don't set the budget. The stakeholder does that. I don't set deadlines. The stakeholder does that. I don't allocate people and resources. That's people and resources. People are not resources. I don't allocate people to the teams. I don't allocate infrastructure. All of that lies in a stakeholder's hands. And I'm not saying that we abdicate responsibility for quality, but rather, if we start to get better engaged with a stakeholder, we can understand how to help them avoid releasing unknowns. We can help them change the perception that quality or testing is simply a fixed cost center. And instead, we start to become an information broker, not a gatekeeper. Testers are not the ones that should be deciding ship or don't ship. Instead, we should be bringing that information up to the stakeholders. But if we don't understand the stakeholders' priorities, if we don't have conversations with them to understand the why they're trying to do things, why they're trying to avoid things, then indeed, we're becoming part of the problem in how we release software. So when I'm talking with stakeholders, and I encourage testers to try to get time with stakeholders, even if it's just part of a team meeting, whether it's during iteration planning or release planning, whatever. There are questions that we as delivery teams need to be asking those stakeholders. And oh, by the way, by stakeholders, I mean the people that are effectively writing checks for the project. And one of the primary questions we should be asking those stakeholders is, what decisions do you need to make? And what information do you need to make them? Again, if we're looking at testers and quality people being information brokers, these are the two guideposts that we should be looking at. Understanding how we can help the stakeholder make better informed decisions, such as, is the system going to be ready to release on our target date? Or do we need to look at reprioritizing scope so that we can improve the stability and performance and whatever of the system? Or, wow, our quality and stability and everything is looking really good. Maybe we can add some additional scope that's reasonable by our target date. But if we're not thinking as a role of information brokers, then it becomes difficult for us to help those stakeholders make those decisions. So something else that remains the same, but I think needs some emphasis, are just simply the skills and roles on a team, particularly as it relates to testing and quality. And nobody ever likes hearing this, but the fact is, we need to focus on fundamentals first. And yea and verily, you can look to all these fancy tools to help you with something. You can dive into, interesting algorithms and AI and machine learning and all these other things. But if you don't have a solid basis in fundamentals, you're setting your team up for a lot of difficulty. And so if we think about reasons that testing or quality is often viewed as a bottleneck, it's taking too long to test. And that happens because we might have a whole lot of pain and drama around test case management. we're spending hours and hours writing test cases, and that leads into long regression cycles. So we're coming up to a major release. If you're part of an organization that has to take an entire sprint or multiple iterations for a hardening phase, which is just testing, I'd encourage you to step back and look at why that happens. And too often we're seeing testing, and I'm not just talking automation, I'm talking testing, period. Testing happens in the last few days of a sprint, or even worse, in a following sprint. And that's just, we've got to figure out how to fix that. Well, we don't have to figure out, we know how to fix it. We want to do better collaboration. If we have a better picture around understanding, around expectations, around who's doing what, that helps us reduce risk. It helps us reduce waste. We've learned, thankfully, that overly detailed test cases are low value. That may be inflammatory for some people, but the point is, all of that time that you're spending writing those detailed test cases, they're not helping. It is waste in the biggest lean sense, because it's taking away from our time actually doing testing and contributing to the quality. So it's time for our third and final survey, right before I get into kind of the next section, which will be on leveraging automation. So this poll is around what you're thinking about planning for automation, specifically test automation, as you're moving forward. So as always, the responses are very interesting. Looks like nearly half of you are already working with test automation, which is terrific. Some are evaluating, and then there's, as always, confusion about where to get started with things. So that'll be open for a little bit more. Oh, looks like the poll's closed. Okay. So this is really interesting. Like I said, about half of you are implementing test suites already, which is terrific. Don't know where to start. Some are evaluating tools, and there are, excuse me, as always, staffing and people and physical resources are a challenge around automation. So let's talk a bit about leveraging test automation. Here's a hard truth. Test automation will not fix your bottlenecks. Let me put a little caveat there that automation alone will not fix your bottlenecks. I talked quite a bit about setting expectations earlier. You have to go into any test automation effort with the absolute clear expectation that automation is only part of your quality effort. How you approach it makes a huge, significant difference in the amount of pain that you'll see, the risk of outright failure, or if you approach it well, some really significant successes. So let's talk about a number of things here. First off, I want to hit automating the right things, doing your automation well, and completing automation in the sprint. And I want to emphasize that I'll talk about other kinds of automation, but really this is going to focus mostly on UI automation. So when we talk about automating the right things, this is really about building great coverage. I've been involved with UI automation for a whole lot of years. I'm trying to think. I probably started writing UI automation scripts back using Perl 20 or 25 years ago. And that was really, really painful. One of the most important things about starting off with good automation is building really great coverage, and that's appropriate coverage. Teams that struggle with automation or outright fail, like spend a lot of time, a lot of money, build up resource for infrastructure and skills, and 6 months or 12 months later have abandoned them. That happens all the time. It happens far too frequently. And it doesn't matter if you're using Test Studio from Progress, or if you're using WebDriver or any number of test automation tools, the basic problems are common across all of those. So some of the major problems that we see time and time again are low value tests. Tests that are focusing on look and feel, tests that are checking that a drop down actually populates, tests that validate that a third party control works as advertised. There's also a lot of duplication where testers will, people who are doing UI automation in particular, will duplicate tests that already exist at a lower level. And then slow tests, especially when we're talking UI tests. Good unit tests run in microseconds, literally microseconds. You can have a suite of 10,000 unit tests that if they're well built and they're properly designed, those 10,000 tests will run in seconds. You move up to the API layer and you're crossing service boundaries. So you've got to spin up a web service. That web service may go down through the stack and talk to the database. It's not uncommon to have API tests that take a few seconds to run. So we have unit tests that are blistering fast. We have API tests that are much slower. And now we get up to the UI. You have to start the application, whether it's a mobile app or whether it's a web browser app or a desktop app, whatever. It takes a significant amount of time to spin up that application. So it's common, and then you've got to do the actual test, right? Click here, fill this in, click over there, validate this thing. Did the back end actually update? Because you can't just trust the UI lies. You do something at the UI, you then have to reach down to the database. So slow tests are, unfortunately, it's just the nature of the beast. So how do we build great coverage? Many of you may be familiar with what's called the test automation pyramid, and it's a triangle or a pyramid that shows that you should have a lot of fast tests making up the majority of your test suite. Those would be unit tests or blisteringly fast API tests. In the middle, you've got some slower tests, again, those database or web service things. And at the teeny tippy top of that pyramid should be a few well-chosen UI tests. And the thing is that if we're going to build good tests, if we're going to get great coverage, tests at the UI should be testing workflows, not features. So we need to understand what the developer is working on, what they're testing. When I say testing workflows versus features, what I mean is, can I indeed add something to my shopping cart? can I create a new contact in the custom CRM that we're building? Also, testing workflows versus features means that we don't test third-party functionality. For example, Telerik at Progress builds a lot of great UI controls. If I'm building a system that's using something like one of the grid controls, it is a waste of time and it's flat out wrong for me to test basic control features like sorting or ordering, because I didn't build that. The team didn't build that. What we care about is that correct data is being put in there. What we care about when I edit something on that grid, that it's persisted and updated in the database. But understanding that we avoid testing low value things or things that don't make sense in the first place is crucial. As part of that, one of the best things you can do, and I call this a critical non-negotiable piece, is to ensure that you know what the developers are testing. If you're building a payroll algorithm, you understand the boundary values that developers are testing with their unit tests, and you don't replicate those tests at the UI level. Instead, you focus on that workflow. Also, building support frameworks, things for creating test data in the database so that you're not using the UI to create a shopping cart. Rather, you hit an API, something's created automatically. It takes a fraction of the time. Automating the right things is crucial. Automating well is just as crucial. There's a lot of fundamentals around stable, high-quality tests. When you don't have that, you see things like teams taking as much time to fix broken tests as they are writing new tests. If you have unstable or poorly written tests, they're failing, they're flaky, meaning they fail and you don't understand why, and they don't give you good information back. Tests are production code. I'll repeat that and I'll bang my fist on my desk. Tests are production code. You have to treat them with the same love, care, and respect that you do the code that you're writing that will actually be deployed to your end users. You have to build those tests together with developers. You need to understand, for example, how asynchronous operations are working on a web page or on a mobile. You need to understand how the data is getting pulled in and combined so that you can best focus on things. And you need to carefully choose again those scripts that you're writing to avoid the duplication, to avoid creating waste, to avoid creating technical debt. Tests are every bit as at risk of becoming technical debt as poorly written system code. So understanding how to automate well is crucial. How many times you may or may not be part of a delivery team that doesn't test in the same sprint that the system work gets done. And if that's the case, first off, you're not alone. Secondly, I'd encourage you to look at getting that changed. Done means automated. Actually, I phrased this badly. Done means tested as appropriate. So when we don't automate in the same sprint, QA at testing absolutely becomes a bottleneck. Because the thing is that if we're having to test, regardless whether it's manual or test automation, and we're doing it 1 or 2 sprints later, what happens when we find a bug? That feedback cycle is nuts. The feedback of having problems comes long after development is done. And so that means that fixing those bugs or the requirements miss or whatever takes far longer. And we've got to change this attitude, this perception that that's business as normal. Successful, mature, well-functioning teams get testing done as part of the work. So testing is involved in the definition of done. If you're not familiar with definition of done, it's an agreement that's reached amongst the entire team from the stakeholder on down of here's what we're going to all agree are the bare minimums for how we roll, for how we operate. And testing as appropriate absolutely needs to be in that definition of done. And I say testing as appropriate because sometimes that means that we have a certain amount of test automation as part of it. Sometimes it means it is exploratory testing. Point being, we then have to ensure that we're sizing our work and our commitments so that not only are we getting development done, but we're also getting testing and deployment done. This requires even more collaboration. That means that you have something like a three amigos or a collaboration triumvirate, or whatever you call it, where BA, stakeholder, product owner, tester all get together to discuss what the work will look like before anybody actually writes code. And that way, everybody's clear on, oh, here's what we're going to do with testing. Developer, you're going to write these unit tests. Oh, we missed a couple boundary values, add these in. Tester, you're going to write these API tests, and here's how we're handling exception handling, and here's the error codes. And oh, by the way, the tester and the developer need to work together to build some backing frameworks for creating test data and test oracles or heuristics. And the thing is that all of that can lead you to getting all of your testing done in a sprint, which is crucial. And time again, I hear this thing of, how can I write a UI test script if I don't have the UI? It's easy peasy. Honest to God, I do this all the time. I talk with a developer before they build the screen. We talk about the workflow, and I build the scaffolding in. I can write, if I'm using WebDriver, all of my WebDriver script commands to reference locators for pages that aren't yet there. I can use tools like Test Studio and build up those scaffolds even if the UI is not physically there. And what I can do is early on, I can get 80 or 90% of that test done and ready. And then when the UI is completely correct, or is live rather, I can run that script. I can fix the one or two inevitable things that I screwed up, but the test is there. I'm totally making up numbers. 80% of all stats are made up, right? I'm making up numbers here. But I can get 80, 90, 95% of my test script done without a UI. And in many cases, as I get better at discussing with the developer, I can get that 100% done to where it becomes an acceptance test. So if you or someone in your organization is saying we can't test until the system is live, I'd encourage you to rethink that. It's a very kind of old school traditional mindset. And I don't mean old school dismissively or disrespectfully. Rather, we've learned how to be better. So here's the thing. Testing and quality should not be a bottleneck. They don't have to be. If you focus on value, if you focus on risk, you can improve value, you can improve collaboration, and you can get rid of those bottlenecks that are holding back your organization from delivering really high quality software really fast. So I thank you for listening on. We're going to have some time here at the end, but I do want to remind that we've got some follow-ups. We're going to have an email that goes out to all of you attendees. There'll be, I guess, some links to a recording so you can go back and listen to this again. And there will be a follow-up blog post as well. Information about that will be in the follow-up email. So with all of that, I want to thank all of you for your time. I held a little bit of time here at the end for question and answers. Let me actually go over and see if we've got anything here in the Q&A chat. Okay. Oh, so here's a good question. Speed of tests. Oh, okay. This is a great question. Somebody asks about speed of tests and brings up the notion of headless browsers. Before I answer that, let me get a drink of coffee because I've been talking for nearly an hour and my throat is dry. Okay, this is a great question. One of the biggest, not one of the biggest time sink for functional tests, right? And let me emphasize that functional test, meaning like checking an action. The biggest time sink is the actual UI. So we have to start up a browser, or we have to attach to an existing browser session. Or if we're looking at mobile development, we have to spin up the mobile app and we have to connect to that. And that takes all kinds of time. Same for desktop applications. So why not just do everything headless? I know plenty of teams that are being very successful using headless browsers. However, the thing about headless browsers is that it's not 100% like the user would interact with the system. Years ago, there were actual functional differences between headless browser implementation and actual Chrome or IE or Edge or Safari or whatever. So there were functional differences between headless and non-headless. So you weren't getting a good representation between headless and non-headless. That has gotten better. However, that still exists. So where I'm going with this is, I prefer to run real browsers, but make sure that my tests are very lean and very focused. One thing that I didn't get into is things like using some of those backing frameworks to do things like, if you're having to log on to your system for every single test, that may add 30 seconds to your UI test. So you may have a test that takes 1 minute to run, yet 30 seconds of it is just logging on to the system and validating that you're logged on. Well, if you build a support framework, maybe you can store a manual cookie for an authenticated user. When you start that test, you load that cookie, and then you don't have to worry about logging on. So then you've just cut your test execution time in half. Where I'm going with this is, my personal preference is to not use headless browsers. I want as real an experience as I can. So I'll look at ways to speed up the tests. Also, we've had an explosion in containers, whether it's Docker or, blah, 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 whatever, fill in your technology of choice. It's easy to scale out now and run multiple browsers, whether you're using Test Studio and Test Agents, or you're using Selenium Grid for WebDriver, or, whatever. I'm not dead set against headless. If you're being successful with them and you're meeting your quality expectation, great. I prefer to solve those speed problems in different ways? That was a great question. Thank you for asking, whoever that was. How can I convince my manager to start doing test automation? We never have time and resources for that. I've been there. I've been that person trying to convince a manager who was dead set against test automation. So I stopped asking permission, and I just did it. So I had to spend a little time on my own, but I found 4 or 5 workflows in our system that were giving us continual problems. And I wrote, I don't know, maybe 20 scripts, and this was all the way back using Selenium IDE, which I don't recommend. Point being, I got a little automation around, and I ran those suites on a regular basis. And I started writing defects, and I'd refer to the automation script that found it. So, bug report, can't add new users, repro steps, see this test script, found. During automated test execution, see this script. And in the space of a couple weeks, as those test scripts found bugs, and I was working with my manager over our test reports, he'd be looking at bug triage reports, and he'd say, "Hey, what's the script? What do you mean the script found it?" And I was like, "Well, I ran this test. I wrote this test script. It found a bug, and here's how we're detecting it, and here's how we're going to prevent it in the future." Point being, over time, and I wrote a small suite of scripts, and the manager saw the demonstration of value. And a year and a half later, I had several thousand automated test scripts because my manager saw the value after I'd shown. So, I had to spend a little of my own time getting that done. Point being, sometimes it's better to not ask permission, but rather get some forgiveness and show value. So we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank folks for a couple really good questions. I want to thank everybody for the amount of time that people had invested watching the webinar. Appreciate I appreciate everybody joining up. And with that, we are done with the webinar. Thank you all and have a great day.